Welcome to Accounting 505 Fraud Examination. My name is Jim Vogt, and I'll be helping to guide you through this fascinating landscape this semester. Fraud examination is a fascinating and important topic, and increasing your knowledge and awareness of the risks of fraud and learning what we can do about these risks will be beneficial to you regardless of your career path. I know that most of you will not pursue an actual career in fraud investigation. However, you will venture out as business people, as leaders, as accountants, and even individual consumers and citizens. For any of these roles, being aware of the extent of fraud and the many risks and costs that fraud represents to all of us, organizations and individuals alike, will prove to be very important and beneficial. Throughout the semester, we will explore an understanding of fraud and the multitude of fraud risks, as well as the prevention, detection, investigation, and adjudication of fraud. You will have available a series of short video presentations that will help supplement the textbook and help aid in your understanding of these concepts. This is the first in the series of video presentations in which we'll pursue an understanding of fraud, its scope, and the magnitude of fraud risk that we all face. So, please join me on this journey into the world of fraud. Here we go. During this first week of class and during our first discussion, I asked each of you to share with the rest of us why you were taking this class and what you hope to get out of it. I know that for many of you, it fits well in your schedule, you needed an elective, you appreciated the fact that it was online and during the summer. All of those are viable reasons. But the fact is that fraud examination is definitely a departure from your typical accounting class. It's very much unlike your intermediate accounting, your financial, managerial accounting. It's very different than your audit classes, any of your other accounting classes. Of course, we will be talking about accounting, but in addition to that, this is a very multidisciplinary study. We will talk a great deal about law. We'll talk about criminology. We'll spend a lot of time talking about psychology, the psychology of victims, as well as the psychology of the perpetrators. We'll talk about sociology. So we will look at fraud from the perspective of all these multiple disciplines. The next question is, why are we studying this? Why does it make a difference? How big is the problem? And how do we even know how big the problem is? How do we measure it? For our first look at how big this problem really is, let's look at the 2018 Payments, Fraud, and Control Survey conducted by the Association of Financial Professionals. In this study, the Association of Financial Professionals surveyed companies across the country about their experiences with payments fraud. During 2017, 78% of these companies were targets of payments fraud. That's over 3 out of 4. 74% of those experienced check fraud. This is level from the previous year, but unfortunately it represented a reversal of a previously declining trend. In 2017, over 77% of businesses were exposed to business email compromise. This is a significant problem in the business world and represents considerable fraud, and it's an increase from the prior year. And nearly half of those reported that the number of attempted fraud incidents, payment fraud incidents, was on the rise from previous years. Of course, this survey measured the threat of fraud from outside the organization. Another organization, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, does a report every 2 years in which they survey certified fraud examiners around the world and try to measure and estimate the level of occupational fraud that exists. Occupational fraud, as we'll discover a little further along, is fraud that occurs from inside the organization. As a result of this survey, the ACFE estimates that the typical organization loses 5% of its annual revenues to occupational fraud. How big a problem is that? Well, if we apply this to the estimated 2017 gross world product of nearly $80 trillion. That means we have nearly a $4 trillion worldwide fraud problem. That is significant. In this 2018 study, there were nearly 2,700 cases that were studied, and in those cases there was a total loss of over $7 billion. The median loss per case was $130,000, and the average loss was $2.75 million. More than 22% of these cases resulted in losses over $1 million. The median duration, meaning the amount of time from the time the fraud began to the time that it was discovered, was 16 months. Again, these are all solid indicators of a very serious problem. But who pays for this problem? Well, of course we do. Fraud affects how much we pay for goods and services. Each of us pays not only a portion of the fraud bill itself, the fraud loss, but also the cost of detection and investigation of that fraud. So I think we can all agree that the global implications of this fraud is significant. But what effect does this have on the bottom line? Well, fraud losses, of course, reduce a firm's income on a dollar-by-dollar basis. That means for every $1 of fraud, net income is reduced by $1. So it takes more revenue to recover the effects of that fraud, since fraud reduces that net income. So if we imagine company XYZ has $10 million annual net income and a 10% profit margin, and we assume that they lose 5% to occupational fraud for a total of $500,000, then that company needs $500,000 in additional revenue to recover that fraud loss, correct? No. In fact, to replace $500,000 in net income, because of the 10% profit margin, 10 times the fraud loss is required in additional revenue. That's $5 million in this case to offset that fraud loss. So by now, I think we can all agree, fraud is indeed a big problem. The next question then, and why we're really here, is what can we do about it? Well, throughout this semester, we will study and we'll investigate and look at the full spectrum of fraud examination. We'll start with differences between auditing and fraud examination. We'll discover that auditors are not the ones who are in the best position to discover fraud. We'll look at fraud prevention and then proceed into fraud detection, investigation of fraud, and finally the adjudication of fraud. Now that you all have an awareness of the scope of the fraud problem that's out there, we're ready to move on to our next video. We'll see you then.